In less than 3 weeks so far, we have over 1,000 Palestinians killed, over 40% of whom are women and children, and over 4,500 who were injured, more than half of whom are also women and children. We have Amnesty International today coming out with a document talking about Israel's deliberate targeting of civilians. We have Human Rights Watch coming out with a report about Israel's use of white phosphorus, which is an illegal weapon that melts skin off of people that Israel has used in civilian areas. And you have the UN-run school that Palestinians ran into for cover, which was clearly marked according to the United Nations, which Israel nevertheless targeted, killing 40 civilians in that place. And then you have Israel's targeting of UN humanitarian work, causing a cessation in the United Nations Works and Relief Agency's humanitarian work in the Gaza Strip temporarily. And the list of atrocities just continues to pile up. By contrast, on the other side, as was mentioned earlier, just over a dozen Israelis killed, half of whom are soldiers. And if you want to zoom out a little bit to look at the broader picture, you will notice that over the past 7 years, Palestinian rockets coming out of the Gaza Strip killed 20 Israelis, and that Israel in a single afternoon at the beginning of this attack 3 weeks ago killed 10 times that number in a matter of minutes. But this is not about proportionality. This is not the primary problem. This is indeed a problem, but the primary problem lies in Israel's narrative of this conflict, which has been adopted wholesale by American media coverage of this issue. The equation became Hamas fires rockets, Israel forced to respond. And no matter how many articles of the Geneva Convention you can cite and how many UN resolutions you can cite that Israel is in violation of, your average viewer doesn't really care so long as that equation sticks. But this is not the proper equation. And the evidence to the fact that this war has little to do with the rockets is an article that came out in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz just a couple of days ago, in which Israeli defense officials were cited as saying that the planning for this war began over 6 months ago. The core problem, the context that is needed in this, is indeed the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the single core cause for which we do not have peace today. Now, it is true that before the occupation there was conflict. There were different reasons that were the primary driving force for that. We can talk about the driving out of 700,000 Palestinians from what became Israel proper. We can talk about the 1956 Israeli, French, British invasion of Egypt. Of course, there are many reasons why there was conflict before the occupation. But the fact remains that since 1988, the Palestinian Authority unilaterally renounced any Palestinian right to Israel proper, which is to say 78% of the land. And this kicked off the peace process with the idea that Israel was going to gradually withdraw from the occupied territories to facilitate the creation of a Palestinian state. Only throughout the peace process from 1993 to 2000, Israel did the exact opposite, doubling the number of illegal settlements. Settlement is just a fancy word for colony. In essence, expanding and accelerating its takeover of the Palestinian territories. And this is why the peace process failed. Now, looking at Gaza in particular, Israel did indeed withdraw its settlers from the Gaza Strip back in 2005. And this was a very interesting public relations stunt in which they claimed that they were shrinking the occupation. But at the same time that they pulled out 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip, they sent 14,000 settlers more into the West Bank, which is also illegally occupied Palestinian territory. And then the Gaza Strip was put under a complete lockdown. Israel controlled every single entrance outlet for the Gaza Strip. They controlled its sea border. Israel controlled its airspace. It even controlled its entrance point to Egypt. I know this is controversial. People say Egyptians are in control of that border crossing. But in fact, Israel dictates to Egypt when to open and close this border. And the evidence of that is that Amnesty International actually cites Israel when it talks about who closes and who opens that border crossing. Now, for the past 18 months, before the whole issue of the rockets, Israel has imposed a very devastating siege on the Gaza Strip. The result was 50% unemployment throughout the Gaza Strip, 70% of households live beneath the poverty line, 80% of the people there dependent on food aid from UN agencies, and you had over 262 Palestinians who died because of lack of access to medical care. all due to Israel's imposed siege on the Gaza Strip. And then you had the ceasefire. And I think this is a very important point which is always missed and always ignored. Whenever we talk about the ceasefire, we always assume Hamas broke the ceasefire. I encourage you all to look this up when you go home and you can have access to the internet. The United Nations has cited Israel has broken the ceasefire on 7 different occasions in the very first week of the ceasefire, before any Palestinian rockets were fired. This was reported in the Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot. In addition to that, towards the end of the ceasefire, which more or less held, on November 4th, on the eve of Barack Obama's election, Israel launched an attack in the Gaza Strip, killing 6 Hamas members, and Hamas retaliated. And now I'm quoting the Israeli government's foreign ministry website. Hamas retaliated, they actually used the term retaliation, to Israel's breaking of the ceasefire on that day. And now Israel cites those rockets as the reason why the conflict goes on today. So I think this is important to set the context, is that the equation is not Hamas fires rockets and Israel responds. The proper equation is Israel telling the Palestinians, what we're going to do is put you under siege in the Gaza Strip. We're going to starve you near to death to the point of having a significant humanitarian crisis in the area. We're going to carry out occasional bombings and assassinations. And we're going to systematically undermine the two-state solution by building more and more settlements in the West Bank. Now, you're free to passively accept this, or if you dare to respond with rockets or any kind of violence, then we're going to use this as justification to massacre you in large numbers and then blame you for it. That's the proper equation, and this is the way that this issue should be actually looked at. Now, why is Israel doing this? I think there are a couple of reasons. One, which Dr. Gause has already cited, which is the deterrence issue. The Israeli military was dealt a harsh blow by Hezbollah back in 2008, and there was an interest in reinstating that deterrence. And of course, Hamas is a significantly weaker force. The Gaza Strip is completely choked down through a 1.5-year siege that allowed virtually nothing to go in and out. So Hamas was a weaker target, and the hope is by defeating Hamas, you might restore some of that deterrence. The other reason, however, is that Hamas began to signal that they're willing to accept the 1967 borders, the two-state solution, as a solution. You don't have to take my word for it. You can see the reports that Jimmy Carter brought back with him a few months ago when he returned from the Middle East. You can see an interview for Khalid Mish'al, the head of Hamas, on Al Jazeera English. If you would like any of these links, I'd be more than happy to send them to you. And this became a problem for Israel because it is not interested in a two-state solution based on the international border. So the only way to deflect attention from this issue is to try to push Hamas to become more rejectionist. And we all know that when you assault someone and put them under pressure, you push them further towards extremism. And if you embrace them and talk to them, you bring them closer to moderation. And bringing Hamas closer to moderation would put the pressure on Israel to end the occupation once again, and that's not the conversation Israel wants to have. The reason of the timing of Israel's assault on Gaza is also twofold. One is the fact that you have domestic Israeli elections coming up in which Netanyahu, the right-wing party in Israel, is actually making significant gains. And so the current government felt that a way to cut into that lead is to prove that they too can be tough. And just over a month before the election, they decided this was a good time to punish the Palestinians to try to win over some votes. The other aspect of it is that Israel was not sure about how the Obama administration would react to further Israeli-Palestinian confrontations in the peace process. So they felt that it's a good time to go ahead and get out of the way any type of undermining of the Palestinians that they can do while they still can for sure, because they know they had the green light from the Bush administration. Hopefully that if then Obama pressures them into negotiations, they can push the Palestinians to accept more humble terms, given the fact that they have just been devastated. In fact, I think you should really check out Jon Stewart's The Daily Show coverage of this about a week ago, if you haven't seen it. It's called Mall Gaza, if I'm not mistaken. I really think it's worth your time. Now, why does this matter to any of us in this room here? The reason why it matters is because Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid, receiving this decade only $30 billion in military aid. Without this kind of type of weaponry, which, by the way, it is against not only international law, but U.S. law to send those weapons to Israel, because the U.S. Arms Export Control Act says that if a country is engaged in gross human rights violations, you can't supply the weaponry through which